Good morning, good afternoon even, it's after lunch. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to be speaking about the neuroscience of diplomacy. So, I'm a neuroscientist by training, but about 15 years ago, I decided to have a complete change of career and become a diplomat. So what I'm going to talk to you today about, first, is some of my work on the brain, neuroscience. I'm then going to talk about diplomacy, what diplomats actually do, and particularly focusing on how we use understanding in all sorts of different ways in the world of diplomacy. And then I'm going to end by bringing it all back together, talking about how my knowledge of the brain has been really useful, actually, in my world of diplomacy. Okay, so I used to spend a lot of time with brains. When I was studying for my PhD, I used to need to prepare brains for autopsy or dissection. So what I used to do would be to go down to the depths of the hospital mortuary, where I'd find a series of buckets lined up on a bench. So I'd pop on my gloves, carefully go over to the first bucket, peel off the lid, plunge my hands in and pull out a human brain. Now, every single time I held a brain in my hands like that, I couldn't help but wonder, how was it that this slightly squishy, pink, convoluted organ is what makes us us? The brain is what enables us to think, to feel, to believe, to wonder, to breathe, to move. It is all down to the brain. Now, the topic we're talking about today is understanding. Oops. And for me, understanding is all about the brain. And I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about the neuroscience and what's actually happening in your brain when you're making decisions and when you're understanding things. But what I want to do first is talk about understanding in diplomacy. Because diplomacy is all about understanding. It's about understanding what people want in negotiations. It's about understanding other cultures. It's about understanding political sensitivities. Now, I don't know how many of you already know what diplomats do. I know that when I joined the Foreign Office, I had very little idea of what we actually did. It just sounded like a very exciting career. So I'm going to give you a snapshot of the sort of things we do. And just to start with, to tell you what I've done in my career so far, I've worked on a huge variety of different issues. We normally spend about 3 or 4 years working on one topic in one country, and then we'll move and work on something else at an embassy or a high commission overseas, or back at the Foreign Office here in London. So I've worked on things like advanced engineering and nanotechnology in India. I've published a book to encourage young Cambodian girls to go into exciting careers. And I've worked on EU policy on Africa. So we're constantly moving, constantly changing, constantly needing to understand different things in different ways. Okay, so let me tell you a bit more now about what sort of understanding is involved in diplomacy. What do we actually do on a day-to-day basis? We spend a lot of time talking. A lot of time in negotiations or discussions. And the image you can see up here with the United Kingdom sign, that's from the United Nations in New York. And so that's a multilateral discussion where you've got a lot of different players and you're all trying to reach consensus, trying to reach an outcome that you will all agree with. Now, the type of understanding you need there is an understanding of what you as a group need to do to reach this one endpoint together. You need to work out what you, as a representative of your country, can or are willing to do and what someone else is willing to do in order to get there. And that type of understanding is very different to what you need in a much smaller group. The image at the bottom there is me meeting the King of Cambodia. And when you're in a small, intimate meeting like that, you're looking at understanding body language. You're looking at understanding exactly what somebody is saying and how they're saying it. It's quite a different type of understanding, but you're still negotiating, communicating, meeting, talking, trying to reach an outcome. One of the most important things that we do as diplomats is support our nationals overseas. So me, British diplomat, I look after British nationals when they get into difficulties overseas. So when I'm working at an embassy, one of my jobs is to see how I can help people, essentially. Now, when I say trouble overseas, that can be anything as simple as losing a passport, can be being involved in an accident, ending up in hospital, people can be arrested. There's a whole host of different things that happen to British nationals overseas. And as diplomats, we need to find ways to help them. Now, there's a limit to what we can do, depending on the framework of the country we're operating in, and obviously, there's only so far that the Foreign Office can help you. But what I need to do is understand, what do those people need in that situation? I need to try and put myself in their shoes and see, right, if they're in hospital, what might they need? They might need to contact their families. They might need to get access to some of their money to be able to pay the hospital fees. They might need help with getting a plane ticket out in the future. It's understanding that individual's needs in that situation. One of the most important times that we help British nationals is during crises. And a crisis can be anything from a natural disaster, like a tsunami or earthquake, through to terrorist incident, violence. There's all sorts of different things that we'll classify as a crisis. Now, the image I've put up here is of when I was sent out to Cyprus, when it was decided that there would be an evacuation from Lebanon, which is the ship that you can see up here. So the Foreign Office has something called a rapid deployment team, which is a group of about 8 to 10 staff who are on standby at any point in time and can be sent out to a crisis to help. So I was on this rapid deployment team. I got the call saying, you need to go to Cyprus. You can see there we turned up in an airline hangar in the middle of the night. And all we knew was there will be some British nationals coming on a ship at some point tonight. So the understanding in crises, using this as an example, is really trying to understand what is happening when you have very little information. Again, it's putting yourself in someone else's position, trying to think, right, if you've had to suddenly leave your home, you're on a ship, you probably haven't got very many of your belongings with you, you might be separated from family, you might have, young children with you who don't have food or nappies. You need to try and understand what might they need. So that's just one example of crisis. There's an awful lot of different ways that we help or try to help British nationals when they're caught up in things like this. Okay, moving on to another way we use understanding. When we're overseas, one of the really important things we do is try and look for opportunities for British businesses. So, for example, when I was in Cambodia, one of the things I needed to do was to identify market opportunities for British businesses. I would meet with them, I would tell them the risks and the opportunities, I'd introduce them to key people in country. But in order to do that, I needed some kind of understanding of what those opportunities were. I needed to understand the situation in Cambodia, but I also needed to understand, to a certain degree, what British businesses had to offer Cambodia. And so this slide is really saying that this is a much broader type of understanding that we need, which is really about what is it that makes the UK unique? What's our selling point? What is it that other countries might want to know about, might make them interested in working with us, collaborating with us? So some of the other images on here, innovation is great. The UK has fantastic expertise on science and innovation. And as a diplomat, I need to know that and just a little bit more about that, just so that I can actually explain that as something really great that actually might mean we want to collaborate with other countries. We'll also promote the UK as a tourist destination. You can see on there, countryside is great, heritage is great. These are all selling points for the UK that we need to know about. And the last one there is a reception we held for Bond film. Culture is great. The British film industry is incredible. And as diplomats, something we need to do is understand that, know about it, and tell people about it. The last 3 slides I'm going to show you about work of a diplomat are just showing you 3 places that I've had the opportunity to visit because I joined the Foreign Office. I'm pretty sure if I hadn't, I would never have been to these 3 places. and each brought me a different type of understanding. So the first one is North Korea. So I did what's called the diplomatic bag run, taking diplomatic mail, essentially, from Beijing to Pyongyang. And for me, the understanding I got of visiting North Korea was an appreciation for genuinely what it feels like to be in a place so different to anywhere I'd ever been before. It's that broader understanding that you can't get just from watching news articles or reading about somewhere. It's that feeling of being there, that genuine, deep sort of understanding of what it feels like. Next place I want to mention, if this works. The suspense. Who wants to guess where this is going to be? Let me try again. Oh, we're back to Pyongyang. No, here we go. Right, so this is the Democratic Republic of Congo in Central Africa. And these images are of the capital, Kinshasa. So I was sent out there as part of the way the Foreign Office supports staff. I'm what's called a TRIM assessor. TRIM stands for Trauma Risk Management. And it's essentially a peer-to-peer support mechanism that the Foreign Office uses. So I was asked to fly out to Kinshasa because some of the staff at our embassy had been caught up in some very violent events after the elections. They'd suffered quite difficult trauma. And my role was to go out, speak to them, understand a little more about what they'd been through, and see if they needed extra support. It's essentially looking for early signs of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I'm clearly not a qualified clinical psychologist, but what you do is you identify the very early signs so that Foreign Office can then provide extra support to those staff who need it, which I think is a really, really good example of looking after staff. And again, that requires a completely different level of understanding, talking, listening, trying to understand what somebody else has been through in such a difficult situation. Right, final place I wanted to mention. This is one of our overseas territories. You can see by the images, it's quite an incredible place to go. And the understanding I got from this visit was what it means to look after our planet. The whole of the area around this territory is a marine protected area. No fishing is allowed. So I went out there with the Royal Marines and with scientists to study the health of the coral reefs, to look at how they'd recovered after coral bleaching, and essentially look at what happens to an ecosystem when you leave it alone. But the understanding I really got from that trip was the impact that we are having on places like this because of the plastic pollution. You can see the image in the top there, those plastic bottles. These beaches were covered in plastic bottles, and these islands are hundreds and hundreds of miles from anywhere else, and still, plastic pollution was everywhere. Okay, let's go back to the brain. Neuroscience of understanding. So, every time you make a decision, neurons in your brain fire. Every time you meet somebody new, a face patch in the brain lights up. That's neurons in a face patch, and they store a memory of that face. Now, if you're one of the people who's lucky enough to actually remember someone's name as well, what happens is one area of the brain memorizes the name, the other area in the face patch memorizes the face, and those connections will form so that next time you meet that person, you are likely to remember their name. Now, I said right at the beginning that one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing as diplomats is negotiating. And when you're negotiating, neurons are frantically communicating across lots of different brain structures, trying to process the information coming in and trying to make decisions about what does that mean, what should you do as a result of what someone else is saying or doing. And what you're really trying to do is understand what someone else is trying to achieve. Now, while that in itself is really useful, what's actually more useful is understanding how they feel about what they're trying to achieve. Empathy. Now, as we've heard right at the beginning on the introduction, empathy is the ability to share the mental state of others. And I personally think that understanding others requires empathy. And you've probably all experienced that, good managers demonstrate some kind of empathy. They show that they appreciate what you're going through, what you're feeling in a situation. But the type of empathy we're talking about here is emotional empathy, and that's normally what we mean when we say empathy. But I want to mention another type of empathy today that I personally think is really important, and that is cognitive empathy. Now, cognitive empathy is when you understand and are explicitly able to use knowledge about someone else's mental state or emotions without actually sharing them. So if you take a consular case, for example, so where I'm trying to help a British national who's in a very difficult situation, stressed, panicky, really sad, emotional, if I share those mental states, I'm not going to be much use to them. However, if I can identify and really understand those mental states and use that to work out what I can do to help, that's far more helpful. And the same in a negotiation. If you can understand what someone else is trying to achieve and how you think they're going to do it and how they feel about it, you can adapt your tactics and put yourself ahead. And that's cognitive empathy. Now, quite a lot of research has gone on in the last few years to look at which areas of the brain are involved in empathy. And the area that you can see there in red, the supramarginal gyrus, has been identified as a part of the brain that is involved in distinguishing our own mental states from the mental states of others. So it's thought that the supramarginal gyrus is really strongly involved in empathy. Okay, let me just sum up there. So, as I said right at the beginning, diplomacy is all about understanding. We use understanding in so many different ways in all the different types of work that we do. And I personally believe that understanding requires good, strong empathy. But as I've just talked about, we're normally talking about emotional empathy. But another type of empathy, cognitive empathy, is really, really useful. And in examples like consular cases through to negotiating and discussing, cognitive empathy can be key. I'm going to stop there, so thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of POR. Thank you.
Okay, wow. So, as Alex mentioned before, POR is 100% funded by donations and support of everyone here, but also we do have some organizations that